Sejam bem-vindos a mais um encontro do Tiaços. Hoje a gente vai ter o prazer de receber mais um nobre convidado, um dos grandes pensadores do campo da psicologia arquetípica, também da fenomenologia, Dr. Michael Sipiora. Michael, vou fazer a apresentação formal primeiro, como de costume. O Michael Sipiora é professor do curso de doutorado em Psicologia Clínica, programa em que ele é presidente associado e diretor de pesquisa. Ele foi convidado a ingressar no corpo docente da Pacífica há 12 anos, depois de passar mais de 20 anos como professor titular na Duquesne University em Pittsburgh, onde ele foi professor premiado em seu programa clínico em Psicologia das Ciências Humanas. O Michael é autor de vários artigos revisados por pares, capítulos de livros e um livro editado. As áreas de ensino e publicações do Michael incluem psicologia, filosofia fenomenológica existencial, psicologia arquetípica e teoria narrativa. Ele obteve o bacharelado e o mestrado em filosofia na San Jose State University. Seus estudos em filosofia se concentraram na fenomenologia, com ênfase na obra de Martin Heidegger. E seus estudos de mestrado e doutorado em psicologia, com ênfase em literatura, foram realizados na Universidade de Dallas. Sua dissertação se baseou na fenomenologia e na retórica clássica, para abordar questões psicológicas na cultura tecnológica contemporânea. Michael, nós aqui do Tiaços estamos aproveitando essa oportunidade para convidar várias pessoas que fizeram parte desse legado chamado James Hillman. Né? De alguma maneira, nós acreditamos que todos nós somos herdeiros desse legado, como a gente falou um pouquinho antes da gente entrar, cada um tentando, a seu modo, fazer com que a obra do Hillman perpetue, continue, se reinvente e consiga se mostrar ainda uma obra contemporânea diante dos nossos desafios atuais. Nós tivemos aqui vários amigos seus, né? Trouxe também um livro, né, Michael? Eu acho que foi o livro que você editou, que é um livro Imaginando a Vida Psicológica, que é um livro em homenagem a Roberto Romanisci, que também esteve aqui conosco. Então, para nós, Michael, é um grande prazer te receber, particularmente a mim, que já venho estudando Hillman há quase 30 anos, esse tema específico que você vem trabalhando nos últimos tempos, a questão da política, ou redimensionar esse aspecto de uma convocação política da obra do Hillman, muito me interessa e acho que ele é muito fundamental no nosso tempo. Então, sinta-se confortável, é um prazer te receber, a palavra é toda sua. Obrigado pela tua presença.
Thank you. Let me do the split screen. So I'm honored and excited to speak with you today. I first wish to extend my heart to you and your fellow Brazilians who are suffering so greatly from the ravages of the COVID pandemic. My hope is that everyone can experience the relief I'm privileged to have in having been vaccinated. My talk has little direct bearing on COVID, but does relate to the crisis of political democracy being experienced in your country and in mine. In what follows, I offer an interpretation of Hillman's thinking about the soul, an arc that spans his recognition of the psychological as inherently archetypal, moves through his understanding of the archetypal as intrinsically cosmological, and then culminates in an appreciation of the cosmological as necessarily political. While not claiming to be either definitive or exhaustive in relation to his opus, I believe there is a significant textual basis for such a reading. My guide has been to take Hillman in the serious but selective manner that he took both Freud and Jung. My prejudice is to take him more seriously at those places where he is most phenomenological, places where he departs from Jungian metapsychology, the collective unconscious self-individuation, and where he positions himself within the concrete world of embodied experience. A cardinal precept of Hillman's depth psychology is its allegiance to symptoms. It's attending to symptoms as disclosing the soul. The symptom, he observed, is the first herald of an awakening psyche which will not tolerate any more abuse. Through the symptom, the psyche demands attention, end quote. Thus, symptoms are not to be taken as problems to be minimized by positive thinking, solved by changing cognitive patterns, or obliterated by pharmacological intervention, but as disclosing underlying matters of importance that demand attention. That is, symptoms are to be listened to metaphorically and not literalized with a diagnostic label. The enemy, according to Hillman, is the literal. It was clear that, quote, the rediscovery of soul through psychopathology reigns supreme over all psychotherapy's other achievements, cultural, social, methodological, philosophical, and he insisted that by clinging faithfully to the pathological perspective, which is the differential root of its discipline, distinguishing it from all others, depth psychology maintains its integrity, end quote. In revisioning psychology, consistent with his approach up to that time, he would insist that the path of depth psychology still remains the individual psyche. However, this was to change as he moved from the Jung Institute in Switzerland back to the United States, where he joined the Department of Phenomenological Psychology at the University of Dallas. Listening to his patients' symptoms in the early 1980s, Hillman heard genuine appraisals of the pathology of the world. In dialogue with his academic colleagues, he came to recognize that, quote, the world, because of its breakdown, is entering a new moment of consciousness. By drawing attention to itself by means of its symptoms, it's becoming aware of itself as a psychic reality, end quote. The path of depth psychology shifts from the individual alone to include, in radical fashion, the world and its soul, the anima mundi and her cosmos. Following that turn, a return of the soul to the world, comes an intensification of Hillman's political concerns and an insistence that individual therapy is an insufficient response to the symptoms brought into the consulting room. He called into question the assumptions of a disordered world that gives rise to individual suffering, the inextricably intertwined suffering of psychological repression and political oppression. Listening deeply, that is, hearing the suffering of the world in both the perturbation of persons and the disturbance of things, he insists that, quote, we must go where the soul is sick and where the unconscious most darkly and thickly reigns, the polis, end quote. A political legacy unfolds in the dynamic of Hillman's thinking about the soul, a movement necessitated by his listening to the speaking of soul and symptoms. The movement is rhetorical, with symptoms persuading, moving us to see through them to the soul's fuller disclosure. When Hillman sets out to revision psychology as the speaking of the soul, he first envisions the psychological as archetypal. That is, the essential qualities of the psychological are those of profound value and intensified significance. These qualities, brought into view by way of psychological ideas, such as those which he puts forth in revisioning, are configured in intrinsic arrangements that he then comes to recognize as cosmological, a nexus of relationships in terms of which the archetypal quality of phenomena appear. What follows for Hillman is that this cosmological ordering both obligates our participation in and provides a measure for the affairs of the polis. First section, the psychological as inherently archetypal. This book is about soul making, announces the first line of revisioning psychology. Indeed, Hillman's whole work was about soul, and he relentlessly critiqued his own discipline of psychology for its all but nominal attention to its very subject. He pointed out that other peoples, most other peoples, had a notion of the soul. For these peoples, he says, from ancient Egyptians to modern Eskimo, soul is a highly differentiated idea referring to a reality of great impact. Only our contemporary psychology and psychiatry omitted from their textbook, end quote. In his own writing about the soul or psyche, terms he used interchangeably, Hillman acknowledged, even affirmed that, quote, he follows the style of other often older cultures which have a better sense of this enigmatic force in human life, end quote. And he uses the notion freely without defining specific usages and senses in order to keep present its full connotative power. At the same time, he recognized the need for more precision when the term is used by a psychologist rather than a romantic poet. Following Jung, Hillman averts that while soul carries the highest importance in hierarchies of human value, it always remains beyond us, greater than us, encompassing us. The human being, he writes, is set within the field of soul. Soul is the metaphor that includes the human, end quote. In Suicide and the Soul, he notes, quote, experience and suffering are terms long associated with soul. They point to the inside meaning of psychological understanding and the reality that cannot be empirically quantified or operationally defined. Hillman's tact in revisioning psychology was to set down a few fence posts, as he called them, identifying the field of soul. Soul is that unknown dimension of worldly existence, a reflective perspective rather than a substance, which is the condition of possibility for the deepening of events into experiences. That is, for things to matter in the distinctive way that gives them value beyond their mere occurrence. Meaning, as the emergence of significance covered over in ordinary functioning, is the dimension of extraordinary relatedness that arises metaphorically out of this deepening. In this dimension, matters of ultimate concern, questions of love and death, and religious questions engage us, as he learned from Jung, in archetypal realities. Archetypal for Hillman denotes the character of meaning, the nature of experience, and the kinds of reality that reflect the soul. These matters of the soul, the psychological imagined this way, are inherently archetypal. In the beginning of his brief account of archetypal psychology, Hillman declares, quote, that it's deliberately affiliated with the arts, culture, and the history of ideas, rather than with medical and empirical psychologies, which tend to confine psychology to the positivistic manifestations of the 19th century, end quote. The heritage of archetypal psychology, as he makes clear, begins with Jung, whose own attempt to break out of 19th century positivism entailed, among other things, a turn to Kantian idealism in his conception of archetypes. While Jung's move takes us out of the reductionism of positivism, it does so at the cost of conceiving of archetypes as non-presented things in themselves. This was a cost, a metaphysical price, which Hillman was unwilling to pay, and hence refused Jung's distinction, quote, between noumenal archetype per se and phenomenal archetypal images, end quote. Archetypal, as Hillman uses the term, is not a priori, before experience, nor is it a posteriori, that is, derived from experience. Hillman's concern is with the phenomena, that which shows itself, which for him is the archetypal. Here he holds to Jung's assertion that image is the primary psychic reality without falling prey to Kantian metaphysics. Hillman reiterates this stance, first acknowledging the initial intent of the term archetypal in depicting a psychology which, quote, remains faithful to Jung's main concern, the deepest nature of the psyche's realities, end quote. Then stressing that the descriptive shift from archetype to archetypal entails a rejection of, quote, the essentialist use of the word archetype, or what philosophy calls reification, hypostantization, archetypes as things, end quote. This shift from archetype as noun, as in a psychology of archetypes, to the adjective form archetypal does not point at anything in itself, but rather points to something, and that is value. About the value which can, according to Hillman, restore our psychology to its widest, richest, and deepest volume so that it would resonate with soul, end quote. For Hillman, an archetypal psychology is, and I quote, a psychology not based on things called archetypes as much as a reevaluation of psychology itself as an archetypal activity that restores to the phenomena it addresses the value and intensified significance that Alfred North Whitehead called importance, end quote. The varieties of experience essential to the human condition, the various matters of importance which claim us in the vicissitudes of life are all, according to Hillman, archetypally conditioned. At play here are, quote, the two senses of archetypal, descriptive and operational, end quote, that Hillman wrestled with in the seminal spring essay, An Inquiry into Image. The descriptive sense of archetypal restores value and significance. The operational sense of archetypal is the activity by which that is done. As Hillman notes, quote, archetypal here refers to a move one makes rather than to a thing that is, end quote. That move is the seeing through of what had been taken literally, an imaginative interpretation that refuses reduction to historical fact, statistical analysis, or scientific verification. Archetypal in the operational sense is what Hillman calls an appellative move that addresses phenomena metaphorically and thus imagines them seriously, as he says, but not literally. Archetypal as seen through leads to, makes possible, the descriptive sense of archetypal and its connotative rather than denotative function. That is, a qualitative suggestion rather than literal specification. Allusion is made to soulful value rather than the provision of evidence for metaphysical structures. Archetypal as an appellative move requires ideas, for as Plato said, an idea is the eye of the soul. Psychological ideas are necessary to bring the soul's depth into view. By psychological ideas, he explains, I quote, I mean those that engender the soul's reflection upon its nature, structure, and purpose. Some of these archetypal ideas arise from the soul's relationship to death, the world, and other souls, with its body, gender, and generation, with virtue and with sin, with love, beauty, and knowledge, with gods, with sickness, with creation and destruction, with power, with time, history, and future, and with family, ancestors, and the dead, end quote. Reflection through these ideas discloses that dimension of extraordinary relatedness, which is the condition of possibility for meaningful engagement with the matters of importance that lay claim on a human life. Quote, these ideas can more readily be called archetypal because they perpetually recur with powerful fascination, both in the history of psychology and in our individual psychological history, where we meet them as crucial, insoluble problems. Next section, archetypal as intrinsically cosmological. Hillman's ongoing revaluation of psychology itself as an archetypal activity took a turn outward when, as recounted earlier, listening to symptoms led him to attend to the world. Ed Casey notes, and I quote, depth psychology as practiced by James Hillman in the mature phase of his work refuses the temptation to turn inward, a temptation to which many other depth psychologies have succumbed, and advocates a decisive turn to the world and the animating soul, end quote. Foreshadowing this turn was his depth psychology of extroversion, presented at several Aranos conferences around the time of his move to Dallas in the late 1970s. It was a turn from, quote, extreme asocial introversion and individualism that characterized his thinking in the 1950s and 60s, end quote, due in part, says Hillman, to Adler's Gemeinschaftsgefühl, that is, social interest, having been missing from his analytic training. The movement culminated in a 1981 lecture delivered in Florence, Anima Mundi, The Return of the Soul to the World, where he recognized that his patients' complaints were sensitive responses to things falling apart, realistic responses to the dead and ugly world that they inhabit. Rather than pathologize these responses as symptoms of individual maladjustment, Hillman came to recognize them as the breaking down of the world as a viable context for what Jung called, quote, esse in anima, the human as sense-enjoying, image-making creature, end quote. Individuals were suffering less from the perennial human condition and more from the condition of the world, the disturbed state of the things which more and more didn't make sense and made it hard to imagine a reasonable human life. In recognition of this situation, he argued, quote, the job of therapy in part becomes one of keeping you acutely conscious of the dysfunctional society, end quote. Hillman discerned that the place of pathologizing, the soul's suffering of meaning, had shifted from the time of Freud and Jung. He came to believe that neither of them had, quote, imagined far enough, fundamentally enough, into the disorder of the world of concrete things, government institutions, commercial practices, the physical, political, and economic unconscious, these symptoms and these pathologies, end quote. Acknowledging that his own categories of psychological understanding, predicated on individualistic intra and intersubjective formulations, were inadequate to comprehend, much less respond to these disturbances, Hillman was forced to reconsider his idea of the external world if he was to genuinely listen to what was disclosed in the world's pathologizing. He came to realize, as he said, my own metaphysical speculations bewitched me towards the world, and that he had neglected to fully appreciate the motto from Keats that had guided him in steering clear of metaphysical archetypes. Call the world, wrote Keats, the veil of soul-making, then you will find out the use of the world. Contra Jung's forays into the collective unconscious, in Hillman's endeavoring to remain in the valley and not venture into the beyond, he, quote, had always considered the world out there to be useful for making one's soul. Only theologians and shamans, he insisted, dare speak about the individuals apart from the visible world. But now he came to, quote, read Keats as saying we go through the world for the sake of its soul making, thereby our own, end quote. To conceive of its soul required an alternative to the modern mechanistic conceptions of the world as inanimate, quantifiable, physical substance that he, following often Freud and sometimes Jung, had unwittingly assumed. Looking to the subjugated philosophical and literary traditions he had retrieved in his revisioning of psychology, he sought an antidote to his own metaphysical blind spot bequeathed by the philosophies of Descartes and Kant, a remedy to the dominant STEM conception of the world composed of material facts acted upon with instrumental procedures. The cure was to be found in the ancient idea of the world soul, the anima mundi. While citing its Western lineage in various mystical, transcendental, panpsychic, and pluralistic orientations, Hillman focused on a notion prevalent in indigenous cultures, the idea of the anima mundi as articulated in Plato, Plotinus, and the Neoplatonic tradition, and embraced by romantics like Keats and contemporary poets, including Yeats, Rilke, and Wallace Stevens. Careful to avoid the complex philosophical conundrums that arise from conceiving of the world soul as a transcendent realm of spirit, or even an immanent life force, rather, Hillman directs, quote, let us imagine the anima mundi as that particular soul spark, that seminal image which offers itself through each thing in its visible form, the animated possibilities presented by each event as it is, its availability to imagination, its presence as a psychic reality, end quote. The notion of the anima mundi is both aesthetic and cosmological. Quote, beauty is the manifest anima mundi, the luster of each particular event, its clarity, its particular brightness, that particular things appear at all and in the form in which they appear, end quote. The soulful dimension of the world arises in the appearing of things. They're showing themselves within a constellation of appearances, a cosmos. Here, Hillman evokes the original Greek meaning of cosmos, referring to, quote, the right arrangement of the multiple things of the world, their ordered arrangement. Cosmos does not present itself as an all-embracing whole, but as the appearance of the fitness of each thing as and where it is, how well, how decorously, how appropriately it displays, end quote. In his revision of psychology, Hillman had introduced the ideas of personifying, pathologizing, psychologizing, and dehumanizing in the service of illuminating the archetypal character of the psychological. Later, in the mid-1980s, he came to recognize that both psychologizing and dehumanizing suggest a cosmological praxis. Such praxis is necessary to recognize the more than human constellation of relatedness that is seen when we engage in the seeing through of psychologizing. This praxis makes manifest as well the contextual relations implicit in personifying. What god or goddess appears alone, without a family tree, shorn of a realm of relationships, a genealogy, or pantheon. Just as the adjectival use of archetypal points to value, the adjective cosmological points to order, connection, depth of meaning within a constellation of associated appearances. Avoiding the paranoid metaphysical need for a literal entity, Hillman notes that, quote, any cosmology is an imaginative act, a piece of rhetorical construction, end quote. As such, every cosmology needs to be seen through rather than taken literally, taken as a way of imagining rather than a thing imagined. Imagining the meaning of things through the rhetorical construct of a cosmos brings attention to their meaning as if within a larger order. Such narrating allows things to make sense, to matter archetypally, as archetypally meaningful by metaphorically imagining them within a cosmological order. Far from an arbitrary fabrication, such a cosmological imagination is a response to the soul's rhetoric, its persuasion to imagine an ordering of things that it sets forth in their appealing appearance, the beauty of their showing. Meaning is afforded in relation to other events within an inherent order that is narrative in character, i.e. mythical, a qualitative narrative that makes sense of what it is to be human in terms of relationship to an invisible, extraordinary order that precludes only literal interpretation. Such order is manifest in the principles of beauty, justice, and destiny that Hillman advocates as a basis for ecological psychology. He argues, quote, these three classical principles with mythic proportions are deeper and more appropriate to the soul's concern than any trivium of concepts, end quote. Far from a departure from his earlier thinking, Hillman understands these principles to more accurately qualify the poetic basis of mind with which he identifies the soul in revisioning. What is more, cosmological myths in which these principles are embedded, quote, place us in the world and involve us with it. The next section, cosmological as necessarily political. Just as listening archetypally to what was disclosed in his patient's suffering led Hillman to the cosmological disorder of the world soul, responding to that disorder called for an alternative idea of therapy and a cultural therapy of ideas. Here we are at the third moment in Hillman's thinking, the cosmological as necessarily political. He notes with agreement that when Aristotle says we are by nature political, he means that the structure and purpose of humankind is political. The polis is the site of human existence, the locale of the arts, culture, and the history of ideas with which Hillman allies archetypal psychology, the place where we live out our character, the context in which we struggle with the existential dilemmas of love, death, and religious experience that animate our psychological lives. Attending to these political matters from a cosmological perspective allows us to take the measure of things, to discern the sake, the soulful value of the things that are the matter at hand. Value as in Whitehead's importance, the deeper value that Hillman says, quote, presents a claim, moral, erotic, intellectual, aesthetic, and demands a response, end quote. So it is that seeing through the personal into the cosmological disorder of the world soul requires our participation in the affairs of the polis. The command of beauty evokes the sense of wonder that appreciates things natural and human constructed. The principle of justice obligates us to engage things appropriately, giving them their due, be it respect or abhorrence. And the calling of destiny requires an attention to the events of our lives, analysis of their import, and discernment of their necessity. Just as he questioned his metaphysical assumptions about the world, he likewise held, quote, some severe doubts about the individualistic ontology that was his faith and remains the faith of psychotherapy in general, end quote. He came to understand that his Jungian notion of an individuated center of one's being was itself a kind of relational self, an interiorization of community, his Zurich community, living and dead, in which he was, quote, unable to differentiate individuation from alienation, and which reflected a social political context which he, immersed in individualism, did not recognize, end quote. Ultimately, Hillman came to recognize the hyper-individualism propagated by most psychology is a disease, supported, quote, supported and promoted by our economics, our entertainment, our refrigeration, our modes of communication and transportation, and of course, our medications, end quote. And maybe most crucially, by our whole system of education, our technically oriented education that serves the economy at the expense of the arts and humanities. An education in calculation without imagination, neither aesthetic nor moral, that serves as an indoctrination into what Hillman called a psychopathic society of manipulations, end quote. In opposition to individualism, Hillman offered a relational conception of a self among, not a self apart. His notion of the self as the interiorization of community, quote, reimagining the idea of self as the locus or focus of visitations and semi-permanent residential inhabitants, both dead and alive, both older than ourselves and not yet born, both of this world and other worlds, and interiorizations as well of the various communities to which we give allegiance in daily life. Interiorization, as Hillman uses the term, is not a process of introjection into an encapsulated subjectivity, but rather a connecting and appropriating of something as having an essential significance, such that I am bound to it and it constitutes part of me. Interiorization is an intimate communion that gives meaning to the specific relatedness that constitute a particular self. Further, Hillman is not literalizing community. Instead, he is, quote, intending towards Alfred's Gemeinschaftsgefühl, a social feeling that fictionalizes many goals, many literal political activities, as retorts for the feeling, where object libido can be intensified, differentiated, manifested. Throughout, one imagines oneself as a citizen, where discourse about self and reading of the self and its actions is conceived always within the context of Gemeinschaftsgefühl, end quote. Gemeinschaftsgefühl, most often translated as community feeling or social interest, is our participation in the commons, manifests both as empathy, cooperation, and respect for others in our concrete engagements, and as our investments in the ideals of communal life that inform our engagement in the polis. A rule of archetypal psychology, according to Hillman, is to start right where you are. And that for Hillman was in the throes of Western capitalism. In his public address, Farewell to Welfare, Hillman expressed outrage at, quote, unbridled late-stage capitalism, euphemistically called the free market economy, and he flat out described it as a runaway nightmare. He cautioned, and I quote, beware of taking capitalist free market economics as a science, or as a progressively developing system, or as equivalent with and necessary to our American dream of political democracy. The economy that rules our lives is also our morality, a psychology, and even a monotheistic belief that converts all values into its one bottom line, end quote. These sentiments echo what he asserted in Kinds of Power, a book specifically addressed to the business community. There he claims that business, and I quote, as defined by the ideas of Western capitalism, has become the fundamental force in human society. Business ideas have penetrated and then colonized most of contemporary life, public and private. They have become internalized and ruled by psychological means. Indeed, they are so, quoting Hillman, unquestionably and universally accepted It's the economy where the contemporary unconscious resides and where psychological analysis is needed, end quote. Unconsciousness, Hillman reminds us, is exactly what the word says, quote, what is least conscious because it is most usual, most familiar, most everyday. That is the round of business, end quote. In naming the economy as the collective's unconscious today, he means that the values of capitalism, the practices of market economics, and the ideas of business are, without our direct awareness, the operative modes of sense-making that guide us in virtually all areas of life. Repressed in this unconsciousness are any valuations with which to envision the social, political, historical realities of everyday life, leading to the disruption of that business-defined daily life by the symptomatic return of those realities which have been repressed. The psyche, Hillman asserts, is literalized in economics. All value reducible to cost efficiency as decisive. The oppressive reign of reality, defined in terms of business, correlates with both the economic injustice that is widespread today and is testified to by the ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, the ugly state of our civil life, as well as the accelerating climate crisis that threatens us locally and across the planet. It's no surprise, as Hillman noted, that, quote, the therapists in the trenches have to face an awful lot of the social, political, and economic failures of capitalism, end quote. He acknowledges that individual therapy is necessary, but it can never be sufficient as the core of the malaise is collective. The practice of psychotherapy not being sufficient to the distress disclosed in the consulting room, Hillman turned to a cultural psychology enacted as a therapy of ideas. Quote, dysfunctional ideas in the world claim our psychological care today. I have more and more shifted my psychological practice from the individual psyche in the consulting room to the wider psyche in the public arena and its deeper roots in root ideas. I call my work now a therapy of ideas rather than a therapy of persons, end quote. Based on his wide-ranging scholarship in the humanities, as well as his clinical acumen, Hillman practiced therapy on the archetypal ideas, self, world, and nature, money, power, and war, childhood and aging, the condition, the quality of contemporary life. His overriding concern was always, quote, how the soul can be in the world and in the best manner fulfilled, end quote. Just as a critical seeing through of individualism is crucial to therapy's cultivation of a relational self, Hillman's therapy of the idea of the economy is critical to a retrieval of our political sensibilities. Breaking us out of the numbness that besets life in late-stage capitalism was a primary rhetorical task of Hillman's therapy of ideas. His work in the polis was to see through the literalisms that, quote, clamp the mind and heart into positivistic science, geneticism and computerism, economics, bottom line capitalism, and single-minded faith, fundamentalism, end quote. In doing so, he opened the possibility of other modes of discourse. He introduced aesthetic terms that had been repressed in our economic unconsciousness. He offered the principles of beauty, justice, and destiny. Quote, with them, he argues, psyche finds itself in a moral, aesthetic, and intentional cosmos. And psychology becomes the study of the ways phenomenon, including human beings, measure its place in the world, end quote. He directly sought to reclaim discussion of beauty for what he called the democratic tradition. In this vision, the sensus communis, the communal sense of things, includes an aesthetic sensibility that entails being drawn to beauty and repelled by ugliness, a fitting sense of justice and of outrage and injustice, and an intuition of destiny in differentiating what meaningfully lays claim on us from the senselessness that disturbs us. Next section, polytheism. Hillman described himself as, quote, a Platonist man of the spirit who at the same time would be a democratic citizen and polytheistic liberal in soul, end quote. Polytheism pervades the archetypal, cosmological, and political dimensions of his thinking about the soul. Indeed, essential to archetypal psychology is Hillman's insistence on the mythical polytheistic perspective. Unlike a religious polytheism that takes its gods literally as objects of worship, in Hillman's polytheistic psychology, the gods are imagined within the metaphorical discourse of myth. Polytheism means that there are multiple ways in which we imagine and are imagined by the world and our being in it. Quote, gods are imagined as the formal intelligibility of the phenomenal world, allowing each thing to be discerned for its inherent intelligibility, for its specific place of belonging in this or that cosmos, ordered pattern or arrangement, end quote. Hillman's polytheism is undoubtedly that of the ancient Greeks, and he cites its differentiated sophistication and enduring significance in the Western imagination in which democracy appears. No less important, he recognizes, is an acknowledgement of, quote, genocidal and cultural catastrophes that are wrought by the white supremacy, end quote, embodied in this imagination. Accordingly, in relationship to the current globalization of the American psyche, Hillman argues that, quote, rather than applying the epistemology of Western understanding to the alien, the tribal, and non-technological cultures, we would let their anthropology, their stories of human nature, be applied to ours, end quote. Thus, what is cosmologically essential is the poly of polytheism, a pluralism that comes of a metaphorical seen through the literal, that recognizes the inherent multiplicity of experience, the perspectival character of understanding, and the polysemic nature of truth. This is the style that gives things, according to Hillman, a pagan feeling, a style that welcomes myth, personification, fantasy, complexity, and especially humor, rather than the singleness of meaning that leads to dogma, end quote. Promotion of polytheism in the popular imagination was part of Hillman's public practice of a therapy of ideas. Polytheism inspires a pluralistic imagination that can help keep outrage at injustice from falling prey to the enticements of fascist populism and demagogic manipulation. Polytheism is not an antidote to the appearance of racial prejudice and anti-democratic dogmas, but it does challenge their pretense of upholding singular truths. Thus, according to Hillman, while not a guarantee of freedom from political tyranny, yet for psychological reasons, it is, says Hillman, worth considering, end quote. No wonder that in Kinds of Power, his hidden agenda was a polytheistic worldview, in which he, quote, tried to expand all the issues broached in this book towards the diversity of a polytheistic vision. In conclusion, as adjectives, archetypal, cosmological, and political connote both the nature of the soul and the terms in which one engages with it, with the one calling forth the other through the claim of the symptom. Following this claim obligates psychology's service to the soulful conditions necessary for political democracy. Patients are served by the practice of a psychotherapy, a post-self-centered therapy that goes beyond attending to their individual distress, restoring their identity as citizens, and engenders a relational sense of self and cultivates an aesthetic sensibility attuned to cosmological principles. Likewise, the public is served by the practice of a cultural therapeutics that offers critical reflection on the ideas that animate our collective life. By seeing through the literalisms that generate collective unconsciousness and individual powerlessness, a therapy of ideas serves to open a space for political discourse and civic engagement. At this moment in history, Hillman's legacy could not be more relevant. While not in themselves sufficient to bringing about a revival of democracy, our practices as psychologists, as therapists, and public as well as academic intellectuals can and should address the political conditions that give rise to people's distress, can and should empower to address these conditions as psychological citizens. To do less, no matter our good intentions, risks collusion with economic unconsciousness and betrayal of the soul. Thank you.
Excelente, Michael. Excelente. Muito obrigado pela sua contribuição. Bom, vamos agora aos rituais. Quem desejar fazer pergunta, bota o nome no chat, eu chamo e a pessoa faz a pergunta. Diga, Michael.
Marcus was saying something at the same time and that didn't come through. He's okay. I can hear you. So questions in the chat?
Não, as pessoas vão fazer as perguntas, a Isa traduz para você e você responde, ok?
Ok, great.
Eu vou começar, Michael. Vou começar com duas questões. Queria fazer uma primeira pergunta num sentido mais quase junguiano clássico. É possível pensar a obra do Hillman, o legado do Hillman, como sendo aquele que tirou a dimensão política da sombra do discurso psicológico? Ou seja, você acha que a dimensão política que podia estar presente dentro do discurso psicológico, ela ficava numa camada sombria, mesmo entre a comunidade junguiana? Quer dizer, o Hillman é aquele que traz a política à tona e revela que existe um par indissociável entre psique, alma e política. É possível pensar essa primeira junção? Essa é uma primeira pergunta. Vou fazer uma outra, tá? A segunda questão é pensar...
No, I'm not a Jungian. I came to Hillman from a background in Heideggerian phenomenology, and I read him from that perspective. So I can't answer, and I know some about Jung. It's not that I'm ignorant, but it's not my perspective. From my perspective, the way I read Hillman, I'm trying to argue that the psychological and the political are inseparable. Rather than bringing it out from the shadows, it has to be there because we live in the world with others, and I think that Hillman always, one difference between Hillman and Jung, and again, I think there are many different Jungs. I tell my students there's at least 7 different Jungs, so, and if you were to tell me there's nothing in Hillman that was not originally in Jung, I think Hillman would say yes. He's taken a particular strain in Jung's thought out. He says he tries to save Jung's psychology from his meta-psychology. And within that context, Hillman wants to always stay this worldly. He's very much like the Homeric Greeks, where Olympus is the height of experience and Hades is the depth, but it's not outside this world. So that's where he's so phenomenological. He's very worldly. And the polis I understand as the context, not the city literally, but the human context, the place in which historical human existence occurs. And of course, that's the place of the psychological. That's why Hillman turns to culture as the place of the psychological. Our psychological life is always lived in and through things.
Tá. Uma segunda questão, Michael. Você acha que no final da década de 70 ou na década de 80, quando o Hillman vai para Dallas e ele participa do Instituto de Humanidades de Dallas, ele participa ativamente da cidade, de projetos urbanistas na cidade, uma espécie de ativismo arquetípico. Eu acho que é a expressão do David Miller, ativismo arquetípico. Mas no final da vida, me parece que o Hillman ele vai para a política numa dimensão mais filosófica, menos ativista, propriamente dito, e mais pensar uma cosmologia política. É possível pensar esse deslocamento do ativismo arquetípico, atuando na cidade, no cotidiano da cidade, para uma vertente mais filosófica do próprio pensar político? Você consegue enxergar isso na obra dele?
I have to think about that, but I think there were stages here. Hillman came to the University of Dallas in around 1978. At that time, the two professors there were Robert Romanishin, who came from Duquesne, was a thoroughgoing phenomenologist, and also Robert Sardillo, who came from a phenomenological background. But there were other people involved like Gail Thomas and Joanne Stroud. And so even at the University of Dallas, there were lots of conferences in the city. And so that was going. So I think there was a dynamic relationship between Hillman moving towards the world and his encounter with phenomenology, which always pays attention to the world. And then when the political upheaval happened at the University of Dallas, when the Dallas Institute was formed, they directly moved into the city, and that was their main concern. Now, that activism was always very philosophical at the same time. There was always, I mean, Hillman's big thing is ideas, like following Plato, are the eyes of the soul. So he tried to bring in new ideas, whether he was looking at ceilings or sidewalks with Holly White or whatever. Then his later work in the 80s and 90s, I think, continued that. And I think there's some recent videos that Pat Berry shared with me, where he again was, I think, engaged in an activism, but always by way of ideas. So I have to think about whether there's a shift that goes on there. I see more continuity, that there's always ideas and engagement. And I would also argue, and you find this in his biography, I mean, he supported Henry Wallace in the 1940s, the American liberal who ran against Truman, who was the soul of Roosevelt's New Deal. He had leftist political sympathies early on in his life. And I think they carried through. They got submerged for a while when he went to Trinity College in Dublin and then when he went to Zurich, but they were never disappeared. And they really reemerged in his later period in Zurich and then blossomed when he was in Dallas. Like I said, with the Anima Mundi article especially. So I see more of a continuation in this arc. Now, I think there's more than one Hillman. Like I said, there's 7 different Hillmans. There's other readings of Hillman. Like I haven't brought in alchemy. I haven't brought in, and you know, the yellowing of the work is very important. I didn't bring those pieces in, but I think this strand that I'm talking about is a vital part of his work, but not the entirety of his work. And, you know, he's always struggling with Jung. He's always got that, you know, being pulled towards the meta-psychological, and he tries to resist, but sometimes he falls into it. I mean, he was not consistent. Jung wasn't consistent, but that's not a deficit. I think that's a character of a creative mind.
Ótimo, perfeito. Vamos lá, Luciana Ximenes. Lu.
Obrigada, Michael, pela sua palestra. Eu acho que você falou em 45 minutos o conteúdo para a gente ter um grupo de estudos de uns 2 anos aí. Anotei um monte de coisa aqui, mas eu fiquei com uma questão, que assim, eu tenho um termo que eu tenho usado bastante ultimamente, que o Hillman fala no livro 100 anos de psicoterapia, que é que os nossos consultórios podem ser células revolucionárias. E quando eu uso esse termo, as pessoas costumam me perguntar, bom, mas como é que é isso? Células revolucionárias, como é que faz isso? E, na verdade, agora eu estou te repassando a pergunta. Eu respondo de alguma forma, talvez isso que você fala de tornar as pessoas conscientes da sociedade disfuncional. E só rapidinho encerrando, será que a gente está falando da terapia de ideias quando ele fala de células revolucionárias?
Thank you very much. I've written on that question. I gave a paper at several conferences on this. That's my main concern. So I think I say that there's 2 parts of Hillman's idea of therapy as a cell of revolution. First is cultivating a relational sense of self instead of the hyper-individualism, helping people see and experience themselves in a relational way. Now, what that means is that they understand their good and the good of the world around them as together, not a compromise, but that we're all in this together. So cultivating a relational sense of self as the interiorization of community with a sense of the common good is the first thing. And the next thing is following symptoms to ground in the world, to not just stopping at the individual, but moving all the way to the world. For example, in my country, so many people suffer because they have fathers who are dysfunctional and distant, sometimes brutal. Well, and so they come into therapy and they have these father issues. Well, why were their fathers this way? Well, my country has been at war most of its history. And so that my grandfather's generation was in the First World War, my father's generation was in the Second World War, then we had the Vietnam War, then we have the Afghan War, then we have been at war. And our men have been brutalized, have been destroyed. So the therapy is, yes, you have to deal with the personal, but you have to follow it all the way through to being outraged at a society that's continually at war and destroys its fathers by going to war. So that's what I mean by following symptoms to ground in the world. So to repeat, I think there are two steps in making therapy into a cell of revolution: cultivating a relational sense of self, and then following symptoms into their ground in the world. And I think that's very possible to do. You have to do it with, I mean, it's, one does not do it in a heavy-handed way. The end product, according to Hillman, is that we have psychological citizens. That is, the kind of sense-making that is cultivated in psychotherapy is what people then engage the world with. And that's what he calls the aesthetic response, a qualitative response that is able to differentiate experience according to the cosmological principles that I talked about today. So the end product of creating psychotherapy as the cell of revolution is giving birth to psychological citizens.
Ótimo, obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. João Corá, contigo, por favor, João.
Boa tarde. Tá me ouvindo, Marcos?
Sim,
Yes.
te ouvindo bem.
Beleza.
I get excited.
Deixa eu ver se eu consigo elaborar a minha pergunta aqui. A minha ideia, eu estou pensando assim, é possível dizer que a psicologia arquetípica, ela é essencialmente platônica, na medida em que ela busca sempre a ideia que está entre a pessoa e os eventos, ou seja, na medida em que ela evita sempre uma visão literal do mundo ou da alma, né, buscando sempre essa reflexão, enfim, esse movimento meio espelhado, assim, né, de trazer novos sentidos, novos significados. Eu acho que é isso.
I wouldn't call, I mean, I understand where the question comes from and it does make sense, but I would describe that movement as always being mythical. That the mythical is that type of reflection between the literal and that which is other. The mythical always is that illusion, to use an early phrase from Robert Romanician, is always an allusion to what is elusive. And in that way, that I think it characterizes it. Hillman, of course, has a very specific kind of reading of Plato. And in many ways, an unusual reading of Plato, and of course, of Plotinus and then Procreus beyond that. But for example, one of the things that Hillman would always stress in reading Plato is that when Plato tells his cosmological myths, he ends up saying, well, of course, no one in their right mind would believe this, but it has to be something like this. So it's always these allusions to what eludes us, and it just brings them into view without giving them literal definition, but allows us engagement and access. And I think that characterizes myth. And one of the things that Hillman, I believe, so much valued in myth was that it had to be taken metaphorically. If you take myth literally, it ceases to be myth and becomes poor explanation. Or alchemy. If you take it literally, it becomes, primitive chemistry, which is not what alchemy was. Alchemy was a very different metaphorical matter of the hands and qualitative differentiation.
Tudo bem, João? Legal, legal. Ieda, contigo, por favor, Ieda.
Olá, tudo bom, Maico? Obrigada pela sua fala. Vou continuar um pouco a pergunta da Luciana Ximenes sobre essa questão da célula revolucionária, sobre algo que a gente engasga um pouco na hora que vai falar sobre Anima Mundi na clínica, que seria o seguinte, eu até anotei, porque é algo mais complicado e sutil. Quer dizer, como trabalhar essa Anima Mundi sem cair numa literalização? Quer dizer, que ativismo nós estamos falando sem ser um ativismo literal, já que a clínica arquetípica se propõe a metaforizar as questões. Quer dizer, quando a gente entra em temas coletivos como política, ecologia, questões de gênero, como a gente não cair em algo literalizante? Não sei se ficou claro.
Yes, and difficult. A difficult question, a difficult thing to do. A good question, difficult thing to do. My take on this is that the Anima Mundi is brought into the picture by way of the cosmological principles that Hillman suggests, the beauty, justice, and destiny. And that these are the terms, these are qualitative terms in which we want to evaluate things, in which we want to discuss things, in which we want to engage things. So with an economic unconscious, all reality is reduced to what you can quantify, what has market value. So moving to a cosmological perspective means we're going to what is qualitative, but then specifically the wonder that things appear, an appreciation for the awesome character of things that appear as they are, of which we get from the poets, a kind of poetic sensibility, an aesthetic sensibility. I sense that there is an order to things, that in their showing, they're connected, this recognition of connectedness, which of course is the foundation for ecological thinking, you know, and that we are aware when this connectedness is violated. And then further the sense of destiny, that we're involved in this, that it lays claim on us, and that listening to this claim requires being very thoughtful. If anything, Hillman was always asking us to be more and more thoughtful in qualitative terms, analysis, unraveling things to talk about their what-kindedness. So I think that's how we move to addressing the Anima Mundi. Speaking to clients about the Anima Mundi directly makes no sense. But cultivating a sense of appreciation of the wonder of things, a sense of justice and a sense of destiny. And there's a wonderful passage where Hillman says, we all know that any good therapy has to have some sense of these things. That if we don't have a sense of these things, our lives are not living. They're empty, they're vacuous. So trying to cultivate some of this sensibility, that's what I think we do. But not an easy thing, because we have a whole culture, worldwide culture now, the globalization of this culture, which gives little credence to this. It's soft. It can't be measured. We need evidence-based this or that. It's an uphill battle. I mean, our work is profoundly countercultural. So be it. That's our work.
Obrigada, Michael.
Obrigado, Ieda. Michael, duas questões também que me apareceram agora. Aonde você acha que a filosofia do Heidegger potencializa o pensamento da psicologia arquetípica? Onde é que é a zona de fronteira ou uma zona de vizinhança entre Heidegger e Hillman? Eu estava lembrando do livro do Robert Avens, The New Gnosis, que eu acho que ele tenta fazer uma aproximação entre Heidegger e Hillman. mas queria ouvir a tua opinião. Onde é que há uma zona de vizinhança potente entre esses dois pensadores?
I hate to say it, but I think Avon's book is a very poor book. I don't think Avon's much really understood Heidegger, and so I don't think Avon's has the right direction. There's a book by Vincent Vicinus called Earth and Gods, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Martin Heidegger, which I think is a better place to come from. But what I would say is that Heidegger's way of understanding the human being is always a being in the world with others along things. His philosophical anthropology, I think, is a good basis for archetypal psychology. And that you have to go beyond that to a dynamic relationship with the world. In the book edited by Roger Book called Pathways into the Jungian World, I have an essay a very early essay on Hillman and Heidegger on the world. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a way that we can appreciate the metaphorical, mythical character of Heidegger's thinking when we approach it from Hillman's perspective. And we can also appreciate the philosophical anthropology which is there in Hillman's work when we look at it from Heidegger's perspective. So I think there's a going back and forth. You know, Hillman had an ambivalent relationship with Heidegger. I mean, he heard Heidegger lecture in Zurich when Heidegger would come and lecture to Maynard Boss's students. And we always, back in Dallas, we always had a sinking a suspicion that Hillman knew more Heidegger than he let on. And certainly someone like Ed Casey shows us the relationship between phenomenology, especially Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, and Hillman's thinking. So it's a complex relationship. In a way, maybe for me, a phenomenological reading of Hillman keeps him true to his intent to be this worldly, and is able to more fully emphasize the shift from archetype to archetypal, the shift to a worldly approach rather than a meta-psychological approach. I don't think that's a good answer, but.
Tá. Uma outra questão também que me apareceu agora é se a gente pensar que a regra fundamental da psicologia arquetípica é o ficar com a imagem, né? Stick to the image. Será que ficar com a imagem poderia funcionar como um antídoto contra o inconsciente econômico? Ou seja, se a economia é a nova deusa, a economia do mercado, neoliberal, ficar com a imagem não é evitar descartabilidade, evitar a velocidade excessiva, evitar quer dizer, criar relações, verticalizar, erotizar. O método de ficar com a imagem não seria uma espécie de recusa a uma fantasia neoliberal que nos invade completamente, como se fosse uma espécie de interrupção desse sistema que a gente está tão impregnado, né? Estamos tão intoxicados de.
I think that's a very, very important and insightful question. I would approach it, and because I think the sticking to the image relates to the aesthetic response in Hillman. That the aesthetic response is seeing things as image, that is, how they present themselves on their own terms. And I think that what I am struggling with is working out the character of the aesthetic response in Hillman, the relationship, and I think there's a background here. I think if we go back to the book Jung's Typology and Hillman's work on the feeling function, which is a qualitative differentiation of experience, that leads to imagination and revisioning. and it leads to noticing or notitia, and it leads to the aesthetic response. There's that's and stick to the image is right in there. That this is the wavelength, so to speak, that Hillman is always making sense of things on. However, Hillman many times associates the aesthetic response with the animal, and that it's immediate and direct. And I think that that is insufficient to deal with things in the technological world. And I've written on, I think, the deficiencies in Hillman's approach to technology. That, for example, he talks at one place about the apple on the desk, meaning the Apple computer, and that it appears quite beautiful. But that beauty is an illusion, that you have to recognize the whole world that is gathered by that computer, the ecological damage that is created by the mining that gets to the parts, the world that we are, the virtual reality that we are sucked into and lose our bodies when we're on the Apple computer. That we can't just take things as they appear. It requires a more critical sense making. And that way, I agree with Gingrich in his critiques of Hillman and the aesthetic response, but Gingrich's critique is completely phenomenological, very Heideggerian at that moment. And I'm not agreeing with the rest of all of Gingrich, but on that count, I think he's right, that we need a critical aesthetic response. Sometimes Hillman does suggest that. He thinks that the aesthetic response can be refined through humanistic education. I think that's very important too. But the naive aesthetic response can lead us astray, and that's a danger. So I'm trying to work out this relationship between, is the aesthetic response innate and animal, or does it have to be educated? Does taste have to be refined? I think there has to be a critical element involved there, because the world is not the way it used to be. The difference between the Apple computer on the desk and the apple on the tree is a world of difference. When you pay close attention to the apple in the tree, it gathers a world of nature. And in its colors and textures, you see the reality of nature. It's visible there, right? The apple on the desk conceals the world that it gathers and the destruction that fills that world. So things are different now. And we need to refine our aesthetic sensibility to respond to them.
Ótimo, ótimo. Pessoal, perguntas. Pulei alguém? Tem alguém que queira fazer a pergunta? Lu, Martinha, Pedro, Henrique. Deixa eu ver aqui. Michael, uma outra questão, e aí trazendo mais para os dias atuais. Você acha que a gente vive um momento de enfraquecimento de uma atitude ou de uma imaginação politeísta? Quer dizer, esse aumento dos governos autoritários, de direita, conservadores, é uma espécie de retorno do recalcado, do monoteísmo?
Well, I think we're in an age of great uncertainty, and these totalitarian regimes provide certainty. I also think that they, as recent authors have talked about, they're expressions of anger against the failure of the Enlightenment project of Western modernity, with its market economies and its belief in individual free choice and individual interest. And that vision has not produced what it promised to produce. And that angers people from the left and the right. And that we need to rethink how we imagine ourselves. So what I think is most crucial is, and this is where I think our work as psychologists and psychotherapists is most important, helping people understand themselves in a relational way. Instead of the hyper-individualism, which is expanding across the globe, which is very peculiar Western modern way of being a self. I mean, like anthropologists like Clifford Geertz says, you know, when you look across the scope of history and cultures, this kind of self-contained hyper-individualism is an anomaly. But today it's spreading. This globalization of being like an American is profoundly destructive. And so in therapy, if we can help people see and engage themselves in a relational way, that who we are is our relatedness. It's not the inside, it's a horizontal depth and relatedness with others. It gives rise to a sense of the common good, that very fragile thing which our coexistence depends upon. And cultivating that sense of the common good, I think, is absolutely essential to bringing about any kind of change. I'm rather doubtful that things can change. I think we live in end times. Things have gone so far, but that's my personal pessimism. But I think the most we can contribute is helping people understand themselves in this more relational way, cultivating a sense of the common good. And when that happens, people, I believe, are more naturally inclined to being engaged in political affairs. I mean, community affairs, civic affairs, being involved with each other in the world. And I think that's the most that we can do. Now, along with that is the absolute essential character of polytheism.
Desculpa, vai, Isa.
No, but that's where, and along with that, we need polytheism. We need a pluralistic conception of truth. That's absolutely essential. That no one has the answer. I mean, and where does that leave you? It leaves you ultimately with some kind of democracy. And in order for that to occur, people have to be able to speak in their own voices. There has to be a multiplicity of voices. And sometimes these multiplicity of voices can come together and decide on what benefits the common good. Those are the moments of political democracy. And that's maybe our only hope, I think. I take a lot of this from the American political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, who I have very much influenced by. And in other works, I've tried to frame the political import of Hillman's work in light of Wolin's political philosophy. Because Wolin says the most important thing in a democracy is the democratization of the self, a self that sees its good and the good of others as intricately and invariably intertwined. I know I start to speak too quickly.
Você citando esse autor, você fala de uma recuperação da ideia de demos, né? De um eu que possa recuperar essa noção de demos, que parece que foi perdida recentemente.
Yes, that's the notion. You know, the demos is the we, the people, the nation of a collective identity that appreciates rather than represses diversity. And that's the difficult thing, to have a diverse populace come together in moments of agreement about the common good. So we need polytheism, and we need a relational notion of self.
Perfeito, perfeito. Legal, Michael. Vamos lá. Martinha, contigo, querida.
Oi. Boa tarde, obrigada aí pela palestra, foi ótima. Falando um pouquinho aí da democracia, né, o que eu queria saber, assim, porque os Estados Unidos fica muito como um modelo, né, a democracia, né, do país democrático. E aí, como você falou mesmo, né, tem tantas guerras aí na história, né, em que a Guerra da Coreia, que ele vai lá lutar, né, por uma democracia, mas assim, realmente um país, vamos dizer assim, democrático, né, ou isso é apenas, assim, a gente projeta ou é feito isso, né, uma projeção dessa ideia de democracia, né, quando tem muita questão aí sobre uma coisa muito militarizada, né? De muita questão de exército. Não, como é que essas ideias aí concorrem? Fica sendo uma coisa, um país, vamos dizer assim, politeísta, nesse sentido de abertura, de multiplicidade, ou fica num meio termo, né? Não sei se deu para entender a minha...
Well, I think there's only been 16 years in American history when we have not been at war. And that is shameful. And American democracy has served the American empire, unfortunately. So the American democracy has had, from its beginning, a very deep, dark shadow, both domestically and internationally. And that shadow has to be addressed and dealt with. I think, but we've had always opponents of American empire, opponents to American imperialism. And at least those opponents have been able to speak. So it's radically imperfect. And I don't know what the alternative is, but its imperfections are scary, and they're bringing the world to collapse. I mean, the United States has created so much unrest and so much suffering all over the world, and no doubt that it has also done good things. I'm not saying it's completely evil, but our President Eisenhower warned when he left office of the military-industrial complex. And that has more and more taken over the affairs of this country. And that has caused great tragedy in our country and across the world. So I mentioned Sheldon Wolin. Wolin talks about the democracy as the remembering the political, those moments when a diverse population can come together and, again, as I've been saying, agree on the common good. And that we need to think of democracy not as a form of government, but as a happening, an occurrence, a rare occurrence that has to be hard fought, but it can happen. And I think that's what we work towards. Democracy is a kind of happening, and that archetypal psychology, in the reading that I'm giving it, can serve those occurrences, that happening of democracy. And Marcus, that's the argument that I made in the paper that I sent you, that hopefully will be published in a book soon.
Obrigada, muito obrigada.
Está sem som, Marcos.
Michael, qual é o tema do seu livro, do seu próximo livro?
Well, I would like to take what I've presented today. Well, what I've presented today is a reduced version of a book, which will include some of the materials about therapy as the cell of revolution and those kinds of things. And I'm hoping a short book, hopefully within the next year. I need to work through all these challenges about the aesthetic response and those philosophical conundrums, but that's what I'm working on.
Tá. Pedro Henrique, vamos lá?
Oi, Marcos. Oi, Michael. Tudo bem? Eu fiquei pensando aqui, quando você estava dando a resposta para o Marcos, falando... Enfim, você terminou a resposta juntando o politeísmo e esse self-relacional, e imediatamente me vem à cabeça Hannah Arendt, né? E a pluralidade em Hannah Arendt. Porque com isso tudo eu fui pensando um tanto nessa fenomenologia que, em alguns lugares, vem depois de Heidegger, por vezes mais explicitamente política do que Heidegger. Eu não diria mais política, mas mais explicitamente política. E aí fico pensando, nessa leitura de Hillman com Heidegger que você vai fazendo, que portas isso nos abre para esses outros autores também, como Hannah Arendt, como Levinas, enfim?
You know, Heidegger's politics were atrocious. He was conservative and became enamored with the Nazis. He thought the greatest thing about National Socialism was a world historical encounter with the twin pincers of the masses in America and the masses in Soviet Union. He was a cultural conservative, and that streak in German thought, it's even there in some of the romantics. So Heidegger's politics are of no value to us, I think. I mean, other than a lesson of what to avoid. What I think is that I think Derrida, following from Heidegger, who was always talking about diversity and the things that cannot be deconstructed, like hospitality. I mean, there's a convergence of thinkers in continental thought, Emmanuel Levinas, Paul Ricoeur, Jacques Derrida, about the self, and that we are our humanity is granted by the claim of the other. That the other, in our encounter with the other, we are granted our humanity. And I think that's an important strand of thinking in phenomenology that we can bring into archetypal psychology as well. And Hillman was he liked Levinas's work. You find positive mentions there. And he liked Merleau-Ponty, who was a background for many of these thinkers as well. I'm not sure if I've given much of a response to your question.
Tudo bem, Pedro? Luciana Ximenes.
Michael, a gente escuta de alguns analistas junguianos que o Hillman é muito gostoso de ler, é muito bonito ler a obra dele, mas que não ajuda muito na prática clínica. Queria saber a sua opinião sobre isso.
Oh, yes. I can tell you what I have found most useful from Hillman in my clinical practice. And those are many of the ideas from the soul's code. The idea that what people hate more than anything else is to suffer for no good reason, always thinking it could have been otherwise. But people go through horrible things in their lives. If they can look back and narrate them and see that there was value in what they suffered, it doesn't mean that it's good. It's still bad, but it's valued, that without it, they could not be who they are. I think that's a very valuable idea. And that's the notion of necessity. And it runs through Hillman's work. He stresses that a lot. So giving us a way to think about our lives that he does in the Soul's Code. For example, looking at our lives through Plato's myth of Ur. What if all the things the existentialists say are facticity, the things that we haven't chosen, we chose them. What do they serve? Now, I think it's absolutely important to remember that Hillman does not mean to take that myth literally. He is not a New Age metaphysician. He's saying this is a way of looking at things in which we attempt to recognize the hand of fate and necessity in our lives. When we do that, I think it's liberating. I think it helps us connect with the meaning in our lives, and it moves us along a path of being thoughtful about our lives in other than just pragmatic terms that have to do with who am I as a human being and why does my life matter? So that's one area that I think Hillman is quite useful. Certainly the dynamics that he lays out in much of his writing on alchemy, I think are also useful, although that's not particularly where I go. His understandings of mythological relationships are always important. I mean, certain rules of thumb that he would always give, like whenever there's one goddess or god, you have to look for two others because they appear in threes. So he alerts us to constellations in our experience. I think that's useful. His understanding of the relationship between the poer and the senex, I think is also very useful. The poer et senex consciousness as being so important, you know, and how problematic split archetypes are. My good friend Glenn Slater does a lot of work with technology, a split archetype, that is a Hermes archetype that has been split. I think that can also be useful in therapy. But again, I would say the most useful thing to me is the notion of being able to look at your life and recognize necessity.
Obrigado, Lu. Michael, queria falar um pouquinho menos do Hillman agora e mais da psicologia arquetípica. Você esteve com Hillman desde o final da década de 70. Então, você acompanhou quase uma grande parte do desenvolvimento da própria obra dele. Eu estou me lembrando do Wolfgang Giegerich, que num certo momento ele diz que a psicologia arquetípica havia perdido o seu rigor intelectual, tinha se tornado uma psicologia naif, quase inocente. Qual é o legado? Bom, legado é o título da sua palestra, mas qual é o seu olhar sobre a psicologia arquetípica hoje? Ela sobrevive sem a presença do Hillman? Ela ainda é um lugar, é um campo de produção intelectual interessante? Ela perdeu algo do seu vigor? Qual é a tua opinião? Você, como alguém que participa desde sempre da fundação dela, junto ao Hillman.
I have to first acknowledge that while I was Hillman's student in the 70s and through the 80s, during the 90s and 2000s, I was not keeping up with it. That's when I was teaching at Duquesne. I was still teaching Hillman, but I wasn't reading a lot of his current work. So I lost touch. I mean, there was some contact, but I didn't follow his development closely. It's only been in the last, 12 to 15 years that I've renewed an interest in what I would call his later work. So I have to acknowledge there is a gap there. That's why I disagree with readings like Casey's, that his popular work is just a watered down romanticism and has lost its force. I think it's a successful attempt to bring this alternative way of thinking to the general public. And that was always very much a concern for everyone back in Dallas. And of course, the first one who did that was Tom Moore with the Soul's Code. And so this desire to take the archetypal psychology out of the consulting room, out of the ivory tower, and into the streets was always there. And that's how I understand, for example, the Soul's Code, the book on power, the force of character. I think that they are useful ideas. For the exchange between Hillman and Giegerich in spring about the aesthetic response, I am very much puzzled by. And I wish James was still here to ask him, because I think his response to Giegerich was woefully inadequate. And I was surprised at that. And I don't know what to make of it. I think Giegerich's critique of the naive aesthetic response is valid, and we need to take it seriously. So it's not perfect. So Hillman's work is not perfect. But I don't think it went downhill. I don't think there was a deterioration in its intellectual quality. I just don't. And I don't know if, you have figures like David Miller who work in both camps. And of course, David is a powerful thinking, insightful thinker. And the same thing with Stan Marlin and others. So I think that there can be dialogue with what I would call dissident voices in archetypal psychology, like Gingrich. Unfortunately, Gingrich can be a little difficult to deal with, a little rude, to say the least. And that, I think that hampers the dialogue.
A minha questão é sempre saber, eu acho que o título da tua palestra também tem a ver com isso, o que a gente pode fazer com essa herança, né? Com esse legado que o Hillman nos deixa. Se nós conseguirmos ir adiante produzindo novos pensamentos a partir do Hillman, ou se a gente cai numa espécie de imitação também, ou repetição, que me parece que é um pouco a crítica que o Gingrich faz.
Yeah. Thank you for your patience. I think, no, that's okay. Yes, we can't just imitate Hillman. I mean, there's more to be done. I think we have to, I found that I've been reading Hillman, even though I wasn't in touch with him for a couple of decades. I've been reading Hillman all this time, and I always find new things. I'm always amazed at how powerful a thinker he is. And so I think there's lots of directions we can go with his thinking, that we can develop it, that we can move it. And that's what I'm trying to do with the political, because that was my interest early on in turning to psychology, and I find a way to take that forward and with Hillman's thought, to move it to the political. I don't think he lost steam. I don't think he lost his edge. I don't think he got tired. I don't think he copped out. I don't think he, deteriorated into just popularized romanticism. I think he always had his edge. He was very provocative. But I do recognize there was a very intentional effort to move it into speaking to the general public. And that's another thing that I think is so important about his work, that he was a public intellectual. We need public intellectuals today. I mean, the foremost public intellectual in the United States, I believe, is Noam Chomsky, who has been a voice of American conscience since the Vietnam War. We need to speak in the public realm, and Hillman did that. And I think that's very important. We need, of course, we need alternatives to evidence-based psychology. We need alternatives to STEM. And that's so important. What I've always told my students is that we won't change the world, but our job is to keep these alternatives alive. Don't let them die on our watch. We will always be countercultural, but it's very important to keep these. And in one essay, I talk about archetypal psychology as an insurrection within the Western tradition. And we need to keep this insurrection from inside the tradition going. I think that's very important. So I've been teaching Hillman my whole career, 30, 40 years, and will continue to teach Hillman. And I have students who have carried it forward. Jason Butler published a book on Hillman's legacy in therapy, published with Routledge. And there are a number of Pacifica students who continue to do work in this field. And I think all of our students, all of us need to continue to publish to keep this alive. It's a worthy cause.
Ótimo, ótimo. Michael, umas duas perguntas para a gente finalizar, tá bom? Pedro, contigo, por favor.
Yes.
Então, pensando também nisso que vocês estavam trazendo, desses olhares que subestimam Hillman enquanto pensador, digamos assim, fiquei pensando aqui numa coisa que sempre me pega quando leio Hillman, um pouco nesse sentido, que eu vejo toda essa força e essa densidade filosófica, ao mesmo tempo sempre me espanta o valor que ele dá ao renascentismo em pontos que, por vezes, essa mesma força política em outros lugares teria se levantado contra. Né? E, enfim, sempre fico com essa pulga atrás da orelha. O que você acha disso?
if you could say more about how the political strength could be used against others. I'm not sure I understand what that implies.
Não sei se eu me expressei bem também. O que eu quero dizer é que o Hillman valoriza o renascentismo e de uma forma, a partir de posições, de pensamentos, que em outros lugares eu veria se posicionando contra o renascentismo, falando de uma forma genérica, né? Ficou mais claro?
No, I'm not sure what the last, what ism? Illuminism? Oh, positivism. Yes.
Tá falando de renascença, Pedro?
Yeah, he's a fierce
Renascença.
critic of positivism. Yeah, I mean, that's the move he says he makes. He goes back to the retrieval, right? Because he's trying to retrieve and that's why I call it an insurrection. He's trying to retrieve traditions which have been obliterated in the contemporary, but they're there in the depth of the culture. So that's what makes it an insurrection rather than a work from the outside, but he tries to retrieve those things. There's a way, Hillman, it's the move to Greece that Hillman talks about also in revisioning. Picasso did it, Heidegger did it, Nietzsche did it, and Hillman does it too, this attempt to retrieve of origins. And there's a way in which I think Derrida's critique of moving to origins is important, that there's a logocentric bias here that can be dangerous. That said, I think he is always trying to retrieve ways of thinking that are antidotes to positivism, to literalism, those multiple ways of thinking which value the metaphorical, the mythical, the aesthetic, and that's valuable. That those are the kinds of sense making, and I say that in the plural, not one sense making, but these kinds of sense making are necessary because they're what we're losing. They're what are getting left out of the picture. And he always spoke in favor of those things. As far as his later work, I think if you look at a work like Aphrodite's Justice, which is one of his later works, I think you see his brilliance there. There's a reading of mythology which is uniquely Hillman. It is not just, what anyone else could do. It's quite original in the way he reads many of those myths, but with the intention of illuminating justice as a cosmological principle. So I don't see how one can say that Hillman lost his intellectual vitality when he can produce a book like that. I don't.
É o último livro que ele escreveu, né, Marco?
Margot has told me that there is one other piece that's yet to be published. It's not a book, I don't think, but an essay. So I think it is the last book.
Ótimo. Michael, eu queria fazer a última pergunta. Evitando cair numa espécie de reducionismo político, você acha que a gente poderia dizer que o pensamento político do Hillman é um pensamento de esquerda? Ele é um pensador mais alinhado aos ideais de uma política de esquerda, de bem comum? Ele é um liberal? O que você acha? Qual é a tua opinião?
I think he's clearly a leftist and has liberal sentiments. And that, again, I believe this runs deep in his biography. He traveled in Mexico and Central America before the Second World War, and that he saw the poverty and the political oppression. He studied with a political theorist at Georgetown who also influenced Bill Clinton, American president. Like I mentioned, he voted for the progressive populist candidate, Henry Wallace, in 1948. I think that those leftists, I know he was that way. I mean, having known him, he was a leftist. He was a populist. He was a liberal, undoubtedly. I mean, he went door to door for Barack Obama, even though Obama turned out to be a great disappointment to us. But nonetheless, we thought there was hope. But yeah, definitely, he's a liberal on the left. But I don't think an unthinking, not just a knee-jerk liberal. So yeah, and that's why he said, you know, a Platonist man of spirit, but a democratic liberal in his soul. So I don't, you know, I wish, you know, we all wish he were still with us. I'd love to hear what he would think of the paper I just presented, but I hope he would like it.
Para nós que estamos vivendo um momento de pesadelo político, termos Hillman como referência, né? Teórica, clínica, política. E agora, não que a gente não soubesse, mas é bom confirmar, como uma política mais alinhada aos ideais de esquerda nos dá uma espécie de sopro de esperança para a gente poder continuar adiante. Michael, muito obrigado pela tua participação. Foi um enorme prazer te receber. Não é a toda hora que a gente tem a oportunidade de receber alguém que tenha um conhecimento tão perto, profundo da obra do Hillman e dessa dimensão que eu queria te ouvir. Penso eu, cada vez mais vai se tornar uma dimensão mais importante da obra do Hillman, que é esse aspecto político. Eu acho que isso está na pauta do dia, né? Então, acho que a obra do Hillman ela se renova a partir desse destaque dado a essa dimensão política. Queria te agradecer e deixar contigo as últimas palavras. Obrigado.
I greatly appreciate this opportunity. Thank you for letting me speak with you. I had very wonderful questions. It's been my pleasure. You can tell from how quickly I was speaking, how excited and enthusiastic I am to engage with you. And I'm grateful to you. And I hope that we can move Hillman's political legacy further. That would be a worthwhile thing to commit ourselves to. So again, pleasure meeting all of you, and thank you very much. Bye.
Quando você for lançar o seu livro, nos avise e volte aqui para conversar com a gente.
I will. Thank you. Okay, goodbye.
Obrigado, Michael. Pessoal, obrigado pela participação.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Mais um grande evento do Tiaços. Espero... Qual é a próxima, Lu Ximenes?
13 de agosto, Turnas.
13 de agosto, Richard Turnas, também uma figura ímpar, fundamental, não percam. Bom fim de semana a todos, tá bom? Se cuidem, se agasalhem. Obrigado, Isa. Luciana Ximenes, beijo. Tchau, tchau. Até lá.